Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
Hey, thank you everybody for joining Jacob and I on this conversation of the Voyage podcast. We're really looking forward to this one, especially with the release of The Mandalorian Season 3, because that's what we're going to be talking a lot about. So this one is going to be looking at the unexpected connections between, first of all, the spiritual classic, The Story of a Soul by Doctor of the Church, St. Therese of Lisieux, and the entire series. So, I mean, as of we're recording this, it hasn't come out yet. So we haven't seen Season 3. Hopefully we'll just reinforce so many of the themes that we've seen come up in Seasons 1 and 2 of The Mandalorian. Jacob, have you seen all of Season 2 of The Mandalorian yet?
No. In fact, I want to say that I'm pretty sure this is just a troll episode for me, because not only are we going some deep cut into Catholic mysticism or something like that, which I know nothing about, the author that Mike wants to talk about, but I'm not even caught up on Mandalorian. And so it's just, I am going to be talking out of my wazoo.
Is that a Star Wars term?
But that's where I learned that. I'm going to be talking out of my gru.
You are going to get some heat for that.
Or gru? Is it just gru? Yeah, whatever. At least I didn't call him Baby Yoda, right? I know his name's not Baby Yoda.
And not only for Jacob's sake, but we'll do a little bit of background on this one, because as it even says, as I even described in the intro, these are unexpected connections. You wouldn't on the surface necessarily see, the Mandalorian or the characters in the Mandalorian as like, oh yeah, just like Therese of Lisieux, just like The Story of a Soul. So we can definitely do some background in all of those. So first, just a brief overview of who was St. Therese of Lisieux. What is The Story of a Soul? So she lived in the late 1800s. She was a Carmelite living in France, and she actually lived a very, very short life. She died at 24 years old, and most of that life, or a lot of that life, was spent in a Carmelite monastery. And even before that...
Hey, remind me real briefly, what's the Carmelite distinction? I understand that it's an order, but like, which ones are they again?
So they'd be a contemplative order of priests, monks, and nuns. And they would be devoted primarily to prayer, as monks and nuns are, but they would be cloistered. And so they're separated from the world. They're not the religious brothers and sisters that you would see out in the world, out in society. They have separated themselves.
They're not wrapping people's knuckles with rulers?
No. So,
okay.
and
they're the fun ones. I'm just kidding.
So
I mean, I don't know. They're probably not out. They're hidden, right?
Yeah.
They're cloistered up.
And
okay.
But they would actually mark their origin, going all the way back to the Old Testament in Elijah. They draw they see Elijah as one of their spiritual fathers, so to speak. And so they get a lot of their charisms, a lot of their spirituality from Elijah and St. John the Baptist. But then you'll see more recently, there were two other examples that came a little bit more recent, but not quite as recent as St. Therese of Lisieux, but that's St. Theresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross. And those were two, they lived during the late Scholastic Renaissance sort of period. They kind of lived during the Counter-Reformation in Spain. And it's actually where a lot of the formal kind of spirituality, when it comes to the Carmelites, like so much of the Carmelite spirituality, in more modern times, is kind of drawn from those two, who are also, they're actually both doctors of the church as well. So they're two of the main 37 teachers in church history, in terms of where we get a lot of our theology, spirituality, and things like that. So
did you say were they specifically Carmelites?
Yeah. So John of the Cross and Therese of Avila were. And so Therese of Lisieux would have been very influenced by them and her decision to enter into Carmel. And so, or into the community, excuse me. And so but what made her different? What set her apart? Because there's been a lot of Carmelites since John of the Cross and Therese of Avila. But what sets Therese of Lisieux apart is this, really, she only wrote this one book, and it wasn't even supposed to be like a theology textbook. It wasn't a treatise of any kind. It was really kind of a diary. And it was called The Story of a Soul. And this has elevated her to the status of doctor of the church, where she is one of the most important teachers in church history because of the profound spiritual insights, not just in terms of, like how to pray. Like, she doesn't give you a sort of like step-by-step, almost like mechanical instruction on prayer. She, in a way, like shows how a life can be modeled by prayer. And so how to make your life a prayer. And so that's one of the big impacts that she's had in, like I said, a very short life, not a very prolific life in terms of writings. It's just, and it's not like it's a 500-page diary. It's like a 200-page at the most. And that's when some publishers will include like some of the letters that she has as well to her sisters. Sometimes they'll have compile them all together. But
I see.
But anyway, so.
Well, that's interesting. So in the Eastern side of things here, we don't have doctors the same way that Catholics do, but we do, I think the closest equivalent would be like what we would call a theologian, which is kind of a technical term in the East. And there's only 3 of those. There's the gospel writer John the theologian. There's Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory the theologian. Yes, that's right. And then there's Saint Simeon, the new theologian, and he came out like, towards the turn of the millennium. So he was like 600 years.
You guys are due
later,
for another
so
one.
he's
I think
the new one.
You're due.
Yeah, we probably.
It's only been like 1,000 years.
God help us. God help us. But the reason why I bring that up though is that it's almost like the 3 theologians that we have. They all have their own little operating space because obviously John the theologian being the gospel writer. He's the gospel writer. And then Gregor the theologian, he is what we would, you think theologian, you think someone that can kind of wax eloquent about theology and things like that.
And he's one of the Cappadocian fathers, right?
He is, for sure. And in fairness, he's not called a theologian because he could wax eloquent about theology. Like, there's lots of saints in the Eastern Church that can do that. Really, he's a theologian because of his poetry and because of his mystical writing and things like that. That is the through line. St. John's Gospel is considered a mystical text. But St. Simeon, he was a poet. Like he wrote hymns and things like that, from what I understand. I guess I could be corrected on this. I didn't plan on talking about it, and so I might be speaking out of my GRU again. But like you were saying, like St. Therese, she wasn't a systematic writer. She just kept a diary, but it speaks to these deep, deep truths that are universally applicable. And that's the impression I get from St. Simeon when people talk about him, is that he wasn't a systematic theologian. He was just someone who wrote hymns that are able to represent to other people what the direct experience of God is like. And that would be what a theologian is.
And actually, you mentioned the idea of poets playing this role of teacher, which obviously has very ancient origins as well, right? That was always the kind of the person who would teach the people, whether it was the culture of the people, the history of the people. And I was talking about John of the Cross before. Actually, his primary works of theology would also have been his poetry. So he has Ascent of Mount Carmel is probably one of the most well-known, most popular and influential ones. And then Living Flame of Love, which I don't know if that's the original title or if that was like, an editor's translation or if that was the title that the editor gave after the fact. But those, again, John of the Cross, his works were
probably a good marketing department.
Yeah, exactly. As saints are wont to have.
As saints are wont to have.
So,
that's right. Well, it's a Catholic church. It's very
we're
got deep coffers.
We're nothing. We're nothing if not what about optics? Is that what you're? So
hey, I believe in optics.
So anyway, so you were talking too about how each doctor of the church will have sort of like a not so much like a niche, but just in the same way that every individual person will have like a specific spirituality or something that will emphasize, the way that we refract the light of God's love or whatever. So she too had this sort of little way that she was kind of known for. And so it was her little way that you'll see illustrated in the story of a soul, which is one of the reasons what made it so influential and popular for not just like, again, people look at her as like this very simple, like not super educated person. And yet this is becoming influential to some of the great theologians after her time. She died right at the end of the 1800s. So we've got like the entire 1900s, all these theologians and spiritual writers who have come and that she's been so influential to, not least among them being Thomas Merton, but also Pope St. John Paul II were two that point to her as such a profound influence. But it was specifically through this little way. And that's actually one of that was sort of what inspired this episode or its connection to the Mandalorian is, that's one of the big catchphrases or whatever is, this is the way, and how it becomes the mantra of the people in the Mandalorian, and how it's almost like you almost hear them say it back to each other, like two Christians saying amen. Right. And so this idea of the way, which obviously goes back to the New Testament in Christians referring to or being referred to as people on the way or followers of the way. Yeah. Then you have Therese of Lisieux with the same little way.
Since I can add nothing to this based upon the actual content we're talking about.
You can add fun curiosity.
I'm just going to keep throwing. I'm gonna add asides. Yes, I'm gonna add fun trivialities into this. That's my role today, folks. Mike just wanted an episode that he could just talk.
It's like finally,
right? Like he got tired. Yeah, he got tired of all of my yapping around and interrupting them and things like that. And so he set up an episode.
How can I alienate Jacob as much as possible?
That's what this is. But anyway, one of the texts outside of Christianity when I was young, right? And I was kind of spiritually exploring around things like that. One of the things that really captured my imagination was, Lao Tzu and Taoism and things like that. Famously, C.S. Lewis refers to the Tao in his Abolition of Man essay. And Taoism's an interesting philosophy of life. And I'm not, a syncretist, and I'm not saying go out and be a Taoist. But it's relatively inoffensive to the Christian sensibility.
Well, and to
love
be
the
fair
stuff that
to
gets
C.S.
talked
Lewis
about in
too,
Taoism.
like he compares it to the natural law, which very much has a place in Christian history, Christian theology, and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Well, and that's so. What's cool? The Tao just means the way, right? Like, and so that's all that word. And then Day is the power. So Tao Te Ching is their main spiritual text, and it's the book of the power of the way, or the book of the way and its power, or something like that. I don't know. I don't speak Chinese, Cantonese.
You're doing great.
But anyway, but the way, and so I love the idea of Christianity being understood as the way, because it just becomes a bunch of like, so easily people interpret it as just like a bunch of rules or a bunch of rituals or a bunch of, and it's really, that's just the most superficial experience of it. But unfortunately, some people, that's the only way they ever seem capable of engaging with it. And it's supposed to be a way of existence. And the rest is trappings.
Well, and on the flip side, for those who are maybe super invested in Christianity, historic Christianity, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, is they'll see these examples of saints and they only see the great way, so to speak. They only see, the huge examples of whether it's the great intellect of Aquinas or of Gregory Nazianzus, or they see the great acts of courage in the martyrs, or whatever the case is. And so they only see the way as this huge path that I'm incapable of walking. And that's actually what Therese of Lisieux was able to illustrate is that it's this little way that is actually not only the greater of the two in regards to more people, but it's a way of greater humility. And so even those that we look to as examples of doing these great deeds, of living this, heroically virtuous Christian life, it was because they had followed this little way first that they were capable of these big actions. Does that make sense? And
Okay.
so that was the huge insight in her story of a soul, was this little way. And so I wanted us to, because we see this in the Mandalorian actually, is that there's actually a lot of littleness to it, a surprising amount of littleness that you wouldn't expect to find in the Star Wars universe. And that's actually one of the things.
Are you talking about the way? So I've definitely watched the first season of The Mandalorian. That's what I can contribute here. And are you talking about how most of the stories in that first season are small stories? Like, we're not talking the grand operatic fight the Empire in big space battles, but like saving villages.
So that's what,
and
that was the first kind of like thing that I wanted to highlight about this, is that, the one of the first things that you can draw out from the theology of Therese of Lisieux and the little way is that it's small actions done with great love. So if you can look at, whether it's an individual episode of, season 1, and I would say season 2 follows a similar trajectory. Maybe it gets a little bit bigger, but that was one of the things when it first came out, when season 1 first came out, is that it was in stark contrast to the bigness of the Skywalker saga, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it was praised for this. It was praised that they were able to take this small direction and, make it more of a character study in a sense, and you could explore.
No, that's actually what makes the first Star Wars movie, the original 77 flick, really interesting. And maybe this is true. I mean, I'm kind of making this up as I go, as I think about this. I was about to say, especially on the first one, you're in the desert for a long time, and then you're on the Death Star for a long time. And that's most of that movie. And when you watch the original Star Wars, episode 4, New Hope, it's kind of, The Mandalorian almost feels like a throwback to Star Wars that wasn't super intergalactic. Obviously, it's a space opera. Obviously, it takes place in space, but it's really much more about people in these kind of like locales doing their thing in these spaces. I guess it's bigger than some of the stuff that you see in The Mandalorian, saving a princess and all that stuff. But I think that's why it has the most vibe to kind of the original Star Wars that, I grew up watching when I was a kid.
And one of the things that you will hear when people bring up, especially in New Hope, is that it wasn't originally going to be a trilogy, that it was originally going to be like a standalone. And so it kind of speaks to your point of there was this original intention of smallness that just got bigger and bigger. And so, like you said, the way that you can look at the Mandalorian is it's trying to go back to that smallness, which, like I said, that was one of the things that brought so much critical acclaim to that series when it first came out. And I don't know, it's been what, 4 years since season 1 came out?
Dude, that's wild.
I know.
Man, time flies. But yeah,
So
I guess I'm really kind of behind the ball here. I mean, can we blame Mike for me not having caught up on Mandalorian?
was anybody doing that? Yeah. So not only its smallness in terms of like its story structure, but then, I mean, again, obviously, and you've kind of alluded to, one of the most important characters is the smallest of the characters in Grogu, the, quote unquote baby Yoda, right?
Is that his name? Grogu?
No, just Grogu, I think is the.
What?
Yeah, just like the show notes say, Jacob.
We have show notes?
Yeah.
What?
But
why didn't you tell me that before we started?
Why didn't you tell me that 5 episodes ago? So you get this sense of, the importance of smallness, right? Now, obviously, as we come
almost
to
like
find
you
out,
have to become as like a little child,
so
in
very
order
much,
to
right? And
achieve big things.
that's actually one of the other names for it, right? Is the child, which I think you almost see the Mandalorian use that name for him throughout season 2 as well. If I'm remembering correctly, is you still have this sense of the child, right? Which speaks to the relationship between the two, which we'll actually get into as well. The relationship between the Mandalorian and Baby Yoda. But the idea of the child being so important, and not that having a child be an important character has not been used, right? There's always that sort of like potential within a child, or the innocence in a child, and so, or that purity. And so you'll sometimes see a child used as a sort of like plot device. But here,
there's a new show out that might just be about the effects of a child on a curmudgeonly old man. That's really popular these days.
Yeah.
Can't think of the name of it.
It deserves its own,
Yeah, it probably deserves its own episode.
The Last of Us will think of it at some point, but
yeah.
So
no, but yeah,
so,
exactly.
So in one sense, it's
kids.
You could say
most
it's
of the time
sort of
it's
a trope.
annoying, right?
No, yeah, and
yeah.
like,
Well, and it's not a well loved trope. I'll be the first, which is ironic because I'm such a big believer in the importance of having kids, and like I will talk your ear off about how influential it's been for me and my own development, my own spiritual development, being a father.
You can play Conversation with Jacob Bingo and give it 5 minutes, and he'll say "Children of the Future," and then you'll throw him.
You really could. I talk about the importance of kids all the time. But you know what? I do not look forward to a TV show or a video game in which they have a child that is somehow needs to be like dragged along, or becomes like an impetus kind of thing. Whatever, for some reason, and maybe it's just because I grew up playing video games, having to like drag along annoying sidekick characters, right? But it's not my favorite. It's not my favorite trope, and a lot of people get annoyed by it. What's up with that? This is a profound question.
Of like the anti kind of children mentality.
Well, like kind of like anti-natalism and kind of like kids are annoying and things like that.
It's funny.
It's funny because I don't actually believe that.
You brought up you brought up a different zombie show where they have the whole like bringing kids around. So actually, to speak to that point, I can remember one of the lines that I still remember from the Walking Dead show is they find this new community. And one of the things that they're told to look for is to listen to the sound of children, because a community that allows for children, or where children can actually like not survive and thrive, is one that you would want to be a part of. And so you even get that sense in, like I said, a show that does not speak to hope or the importance of children or the joy of children, but even in The Walking Dead, they got that on some level. And so
that's actually fascinating. That's great.
I applaud you, Walking Dead. I want to find that episode actually.
No one's applauded you in like 7 years, but I applaud
this
you.
This isn't even in like one of the first 2 seasons.
Line.
This is actually like a somewhat later season. I still remember that. I was like, oh, like they caught on to that. But
wow.
Going back
you actually watched the later seasons of Walking Dead.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
We could have another episode of me watching unpopular shows past their prime, right? Me watching shows that everybody started to hate all of a sudden after a certain season.
Yeah, right.
So,
I'll say there's a lot. You ever see those T-shirts that are bumper sticker slogan where it's like, if your church ain't crying, it's dying? Or how's that phrase?
I haven't, but I've heard
about?
That sentiment.
Yeah, if it ain't crying, it's dying.
That's
a reference to like kids crying, and because as is the case in a lot of parishes, it's these classical Christian realities. It's getting tougher to. You see less and less young people in it, right?
Yeah,
and that's a problem. So
no,
anyway.
and you'll hear. I mean, if you follow like certain Catholic media outlets or whatever, priests will say either in a homily or even at mass where it's like, don't take your kid out because he or she is crying. I want to hear them crying because that tells me that this church is still going or still has a future, or,
is not
like
dying.
That. So
because he's hearing the crying.
Well,
we were going through. My parish was going through expansion plans, and we brought an architect in who he's done a lot of church. He's like historic architect more than like a religious architect, but he's done a lot of churches. But one of the things that initially he was trying to bake into his plans was a cry room, where I guess that's pretty common in a lot of places where you got this closet that you put people in with their crying babies, and maybe there's a window, and the tone of the council that was there listening to the architect was almost offended, I would say. It's like, we don't want to remove the crying babies. What are you talking about? Anyway, it's funny.
And yeah, it's one of those
really
where
hate kids as society now.
Well, and so kind of coming full circle to, one of the things that The Mandalorian does well, when not only having the presence of this child, so to speak, and they do make a point in the first season of like, I thought the target was 50. Well, they age differently, blah, blah, blah. So it's like, if we're talking this creature in, the Star Wars world is 50, but it's the equivalent to our, as a human would be as a child. You find out though, that it's not, he's not just somebody who's there for the ride, that he actually plays a pretty important part, for one, in protecting the Mandalorian pretty early on. I don't remember if it's like the second episode after he gets him, but do you remember when he's
that big rhinoceros looking monster thing?
And like he was gonna die. Like he was not gonna, like his weapons had not
I'm sorry,
worked.
Local citizen of that planet.
Yeah.
Who am I to call him a monster?
I know, he was the invasive species. But
yeah, right.
But anyway,
that rhinoceros thing was just living its best life.
And
the Mandalorian got all up in this business.
And so he plays
It's really a story of colonization when you think about it.
Oh boy. So it's just going to get totally derailed. And so this smallness, not only in the story structure, which I think is the bigger thing, that's the bigger, like more important kind of theme, but then in the characters themselves is this emphasis on smallness and how there is this profound spiritual power behind it. And not that you want to use a complete analog to, spiritual power and the Force, but obviously this small character is very quote unquote Force sensitive, right? He's the one that is going to, he's the one who, and you'll see this actually throughout season 2 as well, is going to have a pretty important role to play when it comes to the Force, the Jedi, all that sort of stuff. And so if you want to use that,
that's the impression I got.
And so, yeah, if you want to use
I haven't watched it yet, but it sounds like
as an analogy for, spiritual power, which again, it's an analogy. It falls short in various points. It's not supposed to be a perfect Christian understanding, but if it's Star Wars version of spiritual power, it's going to be in this very small character, but then in these very small actions. And that's where you can even see the Mandalorian as, not being Force sensitive as anything that we've seen, but he has a lot of spiritual power, especially in his relationship with the Baby Yoda, the child character as well.
Well, it's interesting. And so might as well talk about the Force a little bit in regarding this context here. On the one hand, everyone tries to, the problem with the Force is it's such a pop culture relevant thing, and it's completely derailed generations of people's interpretation of like spirituality, right? It's very Eastern, it's very New Agey, and it's very impersonal, and it's the Force, right? It's not a person. And so that's a fundamental problem, and I get that. Now, as long as we've said all that, as long as I've, thrown out that caveat, let's just acknowledge that, it's still possible to talk about the Force within Star Wars and still map it onto the working of the Holy Spirit in our lives, right? It's dangerous for us to not remember that the Holy Spirit's a person. I think that's a huge problem too. Like the Holy Spirit, and for a lot of reasons, like he's really most personified in the words of Jesus, in St. John's Gospel and things like that. I think that's like where he's really defined as a person, because you can go through a lot of St. Paul's writings and feel like Paul is just talking about the force of God when he says the Spirit of God, or the force of Christ.
Well, if you're going to impose that onto it, certainly.
If you impose it onto it, right? Yeah. I'm not saying that St. Paul actually thought that he was a force. But I think that's why people get led astray by that. Anyway, the experience of the person of the Holy Spirit in our lives, though, is the most mysterious. And it is the one that's the most kind of, if I can use this language, kind of panentheistic, right? Not pantheistic, but, we have a prayer. Now I'm gonna blank on it. O Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, who are everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us, right? The language of that prayer is it's about everything's filled with the Spirit of God. And the Spirit of God is at work in all things. And the Spirit of God is the force behind everything, right? So as Christians, as long as we don't fall into the trap of understanding the force as some kind of quasi-pantheism type thing that's impersonal and things like that, I think that we could have really fruitful conversations about the way the force works in Star Wars and understand how it correlates the Holy Spirit.
I've heard and read before that, seeing it less as an analog for the Holy Spirit and maybe more as an analog for grace would actually be more helpful.
That's interesting.
Because then you're not doing this like panentheism like you were describing, or this pantheism of like, because they always talk about like the forces in everything, or the forces, you get that sort of pantheistic or panentheistic spirit. But if you see it more in terms of grace, then that might be more helpful and more accurate in recognizing the relationship. And then you still have that sense of power, like it has power in the world. It has power to not only move mountains, so to speak, but to move hearts.
I like what you said there. I like grace. I like grace as an analog for the force. But as a good Orthodox Christian, I'm going to say that grace in the Orthodox tradition is God. And so it is the activity of God. And I think that's a little different. We don't necessarily have to get bogged down in the theology of it, and unless you can kind of correct me and we're in agreement or something like that. But still, grace is fine. Grace works for the purpose of this conversation too.
Well, and it's one of those where it's like, I don't want to get bogged down in almost like making hyper distinctions, because I think on some levels you could see like, how much is there a distinction between the gift of God and God himself? And even Aquinas would talk about in God's simplicity, like, okay, there are the virtues of God, which are distinct, but they're all come from the same source of God's, perfect goodness. Even though God's goodness can be manifest in the virtue of justice or the virtue of prudence, and yet they all flow from the same source. And so when you
theology nerds out there, we're getting into the essence energies debate. That old chestnut. That has been there's a little bit of there's been a long conversation between East and West about essence energies, and frankly, I am not qualified to give any type of final pronouncement or litigate that.
You mean the thing the church has been debating for like 1,500 years? You're not qualified to adjudicate on?
Well, and I just don't want to say the wrong thing. But this is what we're dancing around, is because I do think evidently there is some kind of formal difference between how Catholics and Orthodox think about grace and its relationship to God. But that's kind of all I can really say without figuring that I'm going to misrepresent both positions. I mean, I could probably misrepresent even the Orthodox position on this if I
Fortunately
tried
for
too
anybody
hard.
who wants to watch The Mandalorian or read Story of a Soul, you do not need to worry about the intricacies of that
You don't
either.
need to worry about the essence energies debate.
Yeah, but
that's good.
So, because like I said, the main thing when we're talking about the little way, right? This is the little way of The Mandalorian / Therese of Lisieux, Story of a Soul. Is you see a lot of different insights in Therese's diary when talking about what does this little way actually look like? Like, what is the spiritual power behind, or where is God's grace working behind these little things that are still objectively little things? She didn't stop a war or anything, but they were done with great love. And that's the position that most of us are going to be in. So in the same way, The Mandalorian doesn't blow up the Death Star, if we're kind of making the parallel between the Skywalker saga and The Mandalorian. And yet he's doing these little things throughout his throughout season 1, season 2, but they're done, especially after he meets the child, they're done primarily motivated by his great love of this care of the child. And you see it, I actually think you see it more explicitly in season 2 than even season 1. Because I was rewatching season 1 as well after I finished 2. So it was like I watched season 1 like I said, it was like 4 years ago or whenever it first came out, and then I didn't watch season 2 right away. And then I watched through that one and went back, and it almost seems more obvious that he's so motivated by love in season 2. But there are these, again, they can...
Well, because there's a climax in season 1, right? And I can only imagine that season 2 and the aftermath of all that is, again, this is the trope, right? That the whole arc of season 1 is the Mandalorian, this lone samurai, man without a name, Western gunfighter guy set in space, learning his humanity, regaining his humanity through the innocence of a child. I imagine season 2 must be dealing with that, right? And season 1 is really just all the build up towards that.
Yeah. And obviously there's something bigger that I'm not going to, because I still want you to like watch it and enjoy it too, but there's definitely something bigger that season 2 has on. But so where do we see this in Therese of Lisieux? One of the things, because she has this very secluded, cloistered life, she's not going to have these huge, profound, at least from the world's point of view, impact, but she can talk about, from her very limited perspective, the spiritual grace that comes from just her response to little things. So, she talks about something painful or disagreeable happening, and instead of just giving a negative look, which again, the other person may not even notice, it's not going to bring down the entire room, but answering with a positive look, answering with a smile, and doing it not because you are afraid of conflict, but doing it because you want that person to feel encouraged or feel loved. That's a incredibly small action that's done with great love. And, it becomes a habit in this small thing, right? You're being trusted with this small thing so that later on, you can be entrusted with greater things. And so,
oh yeah, somebody said that once.
Yeah, and it
sounds vaguely familiar.
It was kind of the person that molded Therese of Lisieux's life in large part. So
must have been a pretty cool dude, bro.
Oh boy, now you really sound like a youth pastor. Like, you got to move your hat. You got to change your hat backwards before you say that.
Yeah, probably true.
So,
no, I actually love that. I don't want to keep interrupting you. Well, I mean, I kind of do, but this is so applicable, this conversation. I didn't know what we were going to be talking about today because you never provide me show notes. But no, but I like this conversation because I'm a father, man, and it's a scary world. There's so many big things happening, and there's so little obvious power in my day-to-day activity. There's so little it feels like can be done in that kind of traditional masculine, let's do something about it.
Well, and that's one of the scary temptations, is because it seems like we're built for, we have to go and conquer this thing or slay the dragon. And so it has to be something as big as slaying the dragon, when if we can rethink, slaying the dragon is conquering these little like interactions that can sometimes bring down a relationship with our spouse, relationship with our kids. That's a much more important, like relevant dragon, so to speak, to our life. And it's going to have a much bigger impact in the 70 to 80 to 100 years we're here. But then obviously for all of eternity, like we're forming our soul in a certain way to just be more open to charity, right? To whatever degree we're able.
Yeah, no. And frankly, it's the only way to keep your sanity as a Christian, in my opinion, because, and this is true. This has just always been true. You go back to the original church, living in a world full of Roman paganism, Roman domination, Roman proliferation. And the first 300 years, I can't even really, I think we're getting back to a place where we can imagine what that was like actually. But only recently, but then throughout church history, right, and all the way through to the various persecutions and cultures around the world in which Christianity has entered into it and been a minority way, and how those Christians deal with the overwhelming power of the dominions and principalities around them,
And sorry,
and they do it just bit by bit,
well, and
Go on,
kind
yeah.
of this actually goes to a conversation you and I have had separately on a totally unrelated matter, but talking about how, the more effective way to quote unquote fight vice, to fight anti-virtue, isn't just to fight it directly, but to fill it with greater virtue, or to highlight the greater virtue that's there. And so it's kind of like, I always think of like, and like I said, I'm not an expert in horticulture, but I think of like when you are trying to, make your lawn look nice, it's not just getting rid of the crabgrass. It's that you have to put down the good seed, the good grass seed, or you have to fill it with so much good that the bad stuff can't get a hold. Right. And
It's
so
called fertilizer. It's poo, man.
well, so
Poo. You got to fill it with poo.
but in the same way, you're not
It's
in a
actually
sense
nitrogen.
just fighting the bad. You're also filling it with something good. And this actually goes to another aspect of Therese's little way when she's talking about when it comes to dealing with so she was living in this religious community where, people were living in close quarters, like they're going to be around each other. And just like in any family, you guys all love each other, but you're all going to bug each other a lot. And this happens between, siblings. It happens between spouses. It happens between parents and children, children and parents. And our first inclination is to just directly fight against the thing that's bugging us, or directly fight against the vice, so to speak, even though being bothered by something isn't necessarily a vice. But one of the things
and the problem is it blows up too. So if you sit there and
escalates,
you're on each other's nerves, and when you're feeling raw towards somebody, even the most innocuous things you can confront them over, and then they're raw towards you, and so they get all super offended at they do something minor, you act upon the minor infraction they did, and in your action it's escalated, like you said, and it's nuts. It's crazy how we do this to each other.
Maybe it's somewhat taken for granted. I mean, it's still not perfectly done in practice, but what she talks about how it's not just about bearing the defects of our neighbors. It's not just about dealing with the weaknesses or the sins of the people we live with, but it's actually in recognizing and highlighting, and even ourselves being encouraged by the smallest of virtues. And so when we can, focus more on the good of our spouse, the good of our children, the good of our family member, then it's not just that the bad thing automatically goes away. I mean, in one sense, it might go away in large part in our mind. We become so fixated on the good of that person that we don't notice the bad as much. But it even happens when you live with somebody, and God willing, your virtues, rub off on them, or have you ever noticed how you become whatever the virtue of your spouse or whatever your family member is? You that becomes, present in you because of the time that you spent together. And so you didn't have to
The two become one.
You didn't have to give them a course on the virtue of temperance or prudence. You lived it out, God willing, and then they were able to, through those little actions of you just living prudently or living temperately, they were able to combat either their own vice or just grow in their own virtue. And so, how does that relate to? I mean, think of, you already talked before about how sometimes it's used as a trope as the innocence of the child softens up the hardened, patriarch kind of character. But we see that same kind of relationship between the Mandalorian and the child in terms of, they're not able to in a sense deal directly with the vices of the other. The child isn't going to be able to deal directly head on with the vices of the Mandalorian, but it was through the virtues that,
Right.
Like I said, the whole rubbing off on each other or the bringing it out in the other person definitely shows up.
Well, here's what I like about, and where I'm kind of, thinking about this in my own mind. The other day I was having a conversation with some friends about how do I want to introduce this? We were actually talking about how prayer is not necessarily just things you say. That prayer, as you go deeper into the life and the life of the church and things like that, and the tradition of the church, big T tradition in the church, how it's also ritual, how it's also what we do with our bodies, how it's also that everything, like I said, this is a way of life.
Yeah.
And that way of life is not a head game. It's not a head game. It's how you move your body. It's the things you do with your person. It's the way you are. And that is not just the ghost in the machine and your body doesn't matter and all that stuff. And so ritual and repetition and commonality, liturgy just means public work, right?
Yeah.
Liturgy means the work of the people. All these things are complicit with, and even in some mystical sense, like prayer itself, right? And we could really kind of go off the deep end as far as all that goes. But what I will say is one of the examples that was brought up in that conversation was there's that scene in Last Samurai. You ever seen that one, Mike?
I mean, it's
Well,
been a
anyway,
while, but yeah, the Tom Cruise one, right?
Yeah, the Tom
yeah.
Cruise one.
I mean, that's like
You can all
almost
hate
20
me if
years.
you want.
No, I think it was,
I saw
yeah.
that in theaters. Yeah, no, it was. It was like 2003 or something like that. It's like 20 years. You're right. Like 20 years dead on. I love that movie. I'm a sucker for movies like that. And so
Very
maybe,
romantic.
I don't know. I don't know if
Right?
it's cool though. Well, it's the idea. It's
Oh, yeah.
whatever,
Romantic
just
in the
dances with
classic
wolves in
sense, not
Japan.
romantic like sexual. Romantic and like,
right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Hi. Go ahead.
But I got you. But anyway, there's a moment where Tom Cruise, he comes from the U.S. and he's a drunk person, and he goes and he gets captured by samurai forces, and the rest of the movie is how the dumb American gets improved by the, culture of the samurai and things like that, right? Because that's how those movies go. But there's a moment where he's detoxing, a montage, and he's narrating over his diary all the things that he's witnessing and how impressed he is by it. And the lady, his hostess, is doing a tea ceremony, and so they're sitting there performing this tea function, and everything about it is hyper ritualized and things like that. And it opens his eyes to how participatory in life a culture can be. And even down to the simplest act of like serving tea. And where I want to go, how this relates to what you were just saying, though, is most of the time when you're pouring tea, you're just pouring liquid into
utilitarian.
a cup. You're not thinking about it. It's utilitarian, right? If you're in a culture where nothing's utilitarian and everything is a virtue, and how you pour tea is a virtue, well, you know what? So is how you engage with people and how you view people, right? And so, and I'm not saying that samurai culture was full of bad stuff, but but if we look at the good things in these cultures, we look at the noble things that we see in other areas of the world, that's something we can notice, is that there's a lot of cultures out there where the dignity that you show other people is not simply this moralistic politeness. It's actually a sacred way of life, and that it's akin to you are viewing the dignity of others and without utility, without objectification. You are viewing them as a sacred part of your life, the same way you're pouring tea is a sacred part of your life. Well, and that's what I'm kind of picking up on with Therese of Lisieux, I think.
And that's and that's one of the big themes of that movie too, is just the kind of the, obviously it's the fish out of the water, like clash of worlds, but it's specifically the clash of this like kind of post-enlightenment utilitarian mindset of the United States war machine, if you want to make it like a sort of allegory for political.
It gets all into that.
But the sort of like kind of ancient view, not even that it has to be Eastern, because that's not exclusively Eastern, but obviously that just kind of creates a bigger fish out of water experience. But you said, it kind of goes, what I wanted to kind of add to that is it is the only way that it can make what St. Paul says of praying without ceasing possible. Because everybody, the caricature is, oh, so I have to be saying, Hail Mary or the Jesus prayer every second of the day. And it's like, well, that's a start, but that's not even really the idea is, and this is kind of goes back to, and I think it might be in Romans when he says, make your bodies a living sacrifice, is it doesn't mean that you are reciting the prayers of the Jewish temple priest every single second of the day. Just like it doesn't mean that for Catholics,
or you're constantly burning meat,
or that you, as for Catholics, are always reciting the rosary. It's that you're making every action, even if it's not an explicitly religious action. And we've alluded to this before, how the line between secular and sacred is not as hard as we'd like to believe it is sometimes. And so, or even though we've tried to draw a thicker line, it's not actually that thick. It's more a self-imposed, separation.
Unfortunately for this modern, and to go back to The Last Samurai thing, ultimately what Tom Cruise's character represents and how the movie portrays the West and things like that is as this desacralized, this unspiritual reality, right? And that's true. Like, that's true. And the constant fight that I have, like with my own children, with my children's friends, with myself, with the world around me, is just how desacralized everything is. My favorite analogy for it is something from an essay that C.S. Lewis wrote. I forget exactly where, but and then there's an author named Kingsnorth who, this is where I learned it from, was actually from the Paul Kingsnorth guy. But it's called The Basilisk. And C.S. Lewis's metaphor was, we're all become basilisk, and everywhere we look turns to stone. In other words, there's no life in the world around us anymore. It's all become unspirited, and it's all just stone. It's all just something to carve up, to break down, to use, to whatever, build with. There's nothing living. There's nothing alive outside of us anymore. It's all just pure utility. Well, and so he calls us all basilisk, the mythological creature where if it looks at you, you turn to stone.
Well, and I think there could be something to be said, because you actually, even before you brought up The Last Samurai, you compared The Mandalorian to this sort of like space age or, science fiction samurai. And
Ronin figure kind of thing.
And I wonder if too, like that's even on like a larger scale, like that's kind of the big difference between the quote unquote good guys and the bad guys in Star Wars, is the bad guys are always presented as this kind of like overly mechanistic or utilitarian view of the universe or view of creation, whereas the good guys, whether it's the rebels or the Force or the Jedi or whatever, they're always the ones who are supposed to be more like seeing life in everything, right? Seeing life.
No, it's totally hilariously accurate. It's hilariously accurate.
And that's what also made
the Empire is a weird, like, Western educated. How does that acronym go? It's Western educated, industrialized. Whatever, weird. It's an acronym for basically Western civilization, but it's this kind of, it's the modern West, and the Empire really, really is the tropes of that. And that's a hilarious point.
Well, and it's what I mean, and this is going a little bit far afield too, but like that's what made Darth Vader so compelling, is because he kind of had a foot in both camps, and that's why he was even ridiculed in the first one by one of the Emperor guys of like you're kind of like your weird religion, or you know what I'm saying. I can't remember the conversation.
He found his lack of faith. How did he phrase that?
But it's like,
but anyway,
so you get this sense of
his lack of faith was most distirbing, though.
So, so with the Mandalorian,
he uses the word faith. Darth Vader does.
So we all should have seen the redemption arc at that point. So you kind of get this in The Mandalorian too, right? Where it's like this, like if he's that samurai character representing, and they always talk about, and like I said, I can't remember if it's season 1 or season 2, where he is like the way of the Mandalorian is this old way, so to speak, right? It's something that dates, goes long before, but then the Empire, because there is still a sort of like Empire representative, right? The bad guys in The Mandalorian. And so you still have this clash of like old ancient ways or old world versus new world. And of course, like the personification of this, obviously representing the Force in this child character. And so who does the Mandalorian, of course, side with? But it's the, big things in small packages kind of trope or cliche or whatever. But it's not even just in how powerful Grogu is. It's the power in the relationship between the two, like the small caring gestures. If you see, like every time they sit in the, like whenever they're about to take off or whatever, the director always makes it a point of like, there's some small interaction between the Mandalorian and the child that shows like, you know, his care for it. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Or you can at least imagine it, right? Or whatever. So it's in those little things that why would the director choose to highlight those or include those, right? Is because of there's the real spiritual power is in that, because that comes to play such an important role when the big fight scenes come on, right? The big exciting explosion fight scenes come on later.
Oh, sure. Well, no, and it's a perfect representation of the proper use of hierarchy, like the proper meaning of hierarchy and things like that, because you have the authority figure or the powerful figure of the Mandalorian, but he's paternalized by the innocence, but also the what's the word I'm looking for? He can't defend himself. He can with his force powers, but like we
even see that's not unlimited either, because like that takes something out. So it's not like
right, and so it's the need to care, and the innate care that arises from just being in vicinity to each other. That is like a proper icon of how hierarchy works in this world, and how institutions are supposed to work, but how we're supposed to work as people. You know, we both have infants right now in our lives, and it's just amazing the sense of wholeness that one feels with their infant child, because you just see. You get so much from the simplicity of that child's existence and the kind of unadulterated, emotional love that they kind of give off, right? Just, when they smile and see you for the first time of the day and things like that. And you have all your complexity because you're an adult and you have a life and it's full of all these different things going on. But the simplicity of that relationship between, in this case, a father and a son, or in our case, a father and a son, right? In his case, a space bounty hunter and a weird baby Yoda.
Just a space bounty hunter and his baby Yoda trying to make it in this crazy world.
Just
crazy
trying
universe.
to make in this crazy world.
Crazy universe, yeah.
Yep, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and
there's plenty more to talk about. I probably need to go watch season 2.
Well, I actually, when I was originally putting this together, I was thinking this is going to be a 3-parter, and I feel like we haven't even gotten to, like, there's 2 other really important themes in the story of a soul that will absolutely connect to season 1 and season 2 of The Mandalorian. So there's a lot to talk about with this. We've obviously incorporated other parts of the Star Wars universe, other parts of pop culture, which is kind of the point, right? Which is, I think really expands the conversation. Yeah, I know, to be able to just drop in and do this.
I couldn't talk about The Mandalorian, so I just so I start talking about Last Samurai instead. How about that?
No. That was, and of course bring it full circle to say, like, The Mandalorian obviously representing. I wouldn't have thought to brought up The Last Samurai. It's been so long since I've seen that, and I think the first time I did fall asleep to it. Isn't it pretty long? But
it is a long movie. Yeah.
But and I was probably too, as you know, Jacob, I'm much younger than you. I was too young to pick up on those themes right
true.
away.
You're just a pup.
So
we haven't brought into this conversation our relationship. You see, I feel a certain paternal sensibility towards you, Mike. And your youthful purity brings down my curmudgeonliness, and that's why we're so effective.
Yeah, something like that.
We got the yeah.
I thought you were gonna say I'm Ellie from The Last of Us. You just want to be Pedro Pascal, though. I think that's what it is.
I am Pedro Pascal.
Always.
Have you seen my face?
Jeez. Yeah. So, well, no. This was a good conversation, Jacob. And I look forward to our other 2. More so, just so that I can teach you about Saint Therese of Lisieux and the story of a soul. But
I'm actually really.
I might have an extra
I'm
copy.
really
I might have to give you my extra copy.
It sounds very applicable to life these days. I would love to.
Of all the orders of
learn more about it.
Of all the orders of the Catholic Church, the Carmelites would probably be the one that would resonate the most with like an Eastern Christian, Eastern Orthodox. So it wouldn't surprise me that the Carmelites would be like the one that, or our Carmelite spirituality you'd gravitate towards. So,
do they hand out Werther's originals when you visit their monasteries?
And
because if they don't, they're missing.
If you can't see this, but Jacob is backing out of the room, saying, "That's all, folks. That's his time." And thank you guys for listening to the conversation, and look forward to talking more about The Mandalorian, St. Therese of Lisieux, The Little Way. Be sure to give us a 5-star rating on iTunes, on Spotify, wherever you're listening to this. Write a positive review, because that's really going to help us grow the show, get it out to more people. More people are going to find it, come across it, so that they can hear how entertaining and smart Jacob is, I guess. And and yeah, we look forward to...
And funny.
Yeah.
You forgot,
that's right.
You forgot
wait,
funny.
let me go back to my list. Yeah. And funny. You're right. Sorry. that Jacob wrote for me.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure it's in the show notes.
And we'll see you guys later. Appreciate it.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.